Why would a billionaire's son trade his Harvard-educated tutors for midnight lessons with the company janitor? Carter Sterling was failing everything: math, science, even art, despite having resources others could only dream of. But when Elias Flynn set down his mop and picked up a marker, he revealed a secret about learning that 23 experts had missed. One that would transform failure into genius. In the cold, fluorescent glare of a high-rise corporate office, where shadows stretched long across polished marble floors, 10-year-old Carter Sterling stood before a whiteboard, his trembling hands clutching a marker that felt impossibly heavy. His entire life had been measured in failures, each test score another disappointment carved into his mother's perfectly composed face. Through the glass door, a man appeared carrying a mop bucket and cleaning supplies, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. The janitor paused, watching the boy with eyes that held unexpected warmth. Elias Flynn, a single father who cleaned these halls every night, saw something in that moment that others had missed. Behind those gentle eyes lived a secret, powerful enough to transform everything. The Sterling Enterprises Tower pierced the Manhattan skyline like a monument to ambition. 47 floors of glass and steel that housed one of the most influential financial institutions in the country. On the 39th floor, in an office that commanded views of the entire city, Evelyn Sterling reviewed quarterly reports with the precision of a surgeon. At 38, she had built an empire from the inheritance her late husband had left behind, transforming grief into determination, loss into legacy. Her tailored suits never showed a wrinkle, her platinum hair never fell out of place, and her composure never cracked, except when she thought about Carter. 3 floors below, in a small tutoring room that the company maintained for executive families, Carter Sterling sat hunched over a practice test, the numbers and letters blurring together like abstract art. He possessed his mother's sharp features and his late father's thoughtful eyes. But confidence had never found its way into his 10-year-old frame. Every question on the page seemed to mock him, every blank answer space a reminder of his inadequacy. The private tutors his mother hired spoke in monotones about potential and application, but their words floated past him like smoke. Elias Flynn pushed his cleaning cart through the hallway outside, the wheels squeaking a rhythm he had memorized over 2 years of night shifts. At 40, he moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned to make himself invisible in spaces where he didn't belong. His hands, once accustomed to holding chalk and pointing at equations on blackboards, now gripped mop handles and spray bottles. In his shirt pocket, he carried a photo of his daughter Sarah, 7 years old and living with his sister in Queens while he worked nights to pay for her asthma medication and save for her college fund. The failing grade came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in a sealed envelope that Carter's tutor handed to Evelyn with the solemnity of a death notice. 73% failure rate across all subjects, with mathematics showing the steepest decline. Evelyn stood behind her desk, the city lights beginning to twinkle beyond her window, and felt something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't just about grades anymore. This was about legacy, about the Sterling name, about the son who seemed to be slipping through her fingers like water. She found Carter in the tutoring room an hour later. Tears dried on his cheeks as he stared at another practice test. The conversation that followed carved itself into both their memories with surgical precision. If he couldn't improve by the end of the quarter, she would send him to Thornfield Academy, a boarding school in Connecticut known for its rigid structure and exceptional success rate with struggling students. The words fell between them like stones into still water, each one sending ripples of fear through Carter's small frame. After Evelyn left, her heels clicking down the hallway like a countdown, Carter remained frozen in his chair. The building had grown quiet around him, most employees having departed for their evening commutes. He wandered into the hallway, drawn by a sound he couldn't quite identify. There, on the wall beside the water fountain, someone had drawn an elaborate physics equation in dry erase marker on a small portable whiteboard. The handwriting was neat, almost artistic, and the equation seemed to dance rather than intimidate. Elias stood there, lost in his work, unaware of his audience until Carter's shadow fell across the board. The janitor's first instinct was to apologize, to erase the evidence of his trespass, but something in the boy's eyes stopped him. It wasn't judgment or mockery he saw there, but genuine curiosity, perhaps even wonder. For a moment, they stood in silence, the equation between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. It's about trajectory, Elias said finally, his voice soft as though sharing a secret. Like throwing a ball, but with math to predict where it lands. Carter stepped closer, his fear momentarily forgotten. My tutor makes it seem harder than that. Most things are simpler than people make them, Elias replied, then caught himself. This wasn't his place, wasn't his role. He reached for the eraser, but Carter's voice stopped him. Could you show me? The question hung in the air, like a challenge to the universe itself. Elias knew he should decline, should maintain the invisible boundary between the janitor and the executive's son. But he also knew the look in Carter's eyes, had seen it in his own daughter's face when the world felt too big and too complicated. Against his better judgment, he pulled over a chair from the nearby waiting area and gestured for Carter to sit. For the next hour, the hallway became a classroom. Elias drew pictures to accompany the numbers, told stories about astronauts and baseball players, transformed abstract concepts into tangible adventures. Carter laughed for the first time in weeks when Elias described gravity as the Earth's way of hugging everything. The boy's pencil moved across paper with newfound purpose, solving problems that had seemed impossible just hours before. Neither of them noticed Evelyn's return until her shadow fell across their makeshift workspace. She had come back for a forgotten file and found her son learning physics from the night janitor, sitting on the floor of the hallway like common students. The expression on her face cycled through surprise, confusion, and finally settled on something approaching anger. Carter, gather your things, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had cowed board members twice her age. Now, as Carter scrambled to collect his papers, Elias rose slowly, his eyes meeting Evelyn's with unexpected steadiness. I apologize, Miss Sterling. The boy seemed upset. And I thought. You thought wrong, Evelyn interrupted, though her voice lacked its usual cutting edge. Something about the way Carter had been smiling, the ease in his shoulders she hadn't seen in months, gave her pause. This is inappropriate. Mom, he was just helping Carter began, but Evelyn's raised hand silenced him. We'll discuss this at home. As they walked toward the elevator, Carter turned back once, catching Elias's eye. The janitor offered a small nod, a silent promise that seemed to say this wasn't over. Carter held onto that nod like a lifeline as the elevator doors closed between them. The next 3 days passed in a blur of traditional tutoring sessions and failed practice tests. Carter tried to explain to his mother what had been different about Elias's teaching, but the words came out jumbled, insufficient. Evelyn, meanwhile, found herself thinking about the janitor's steady gaze, the way he had stood his ground without defiance, the worn photo she had glimpsed in his shirt pocket. On the 4th night, Carter discovered a small rolled paper in his backpack's outer pocket. Unfolding it revealed a series of word problems, but these weren't like any he had seen before. They featured pirates calculating treasure distributions, astronauts determining oxygen supplies, and race car drivers computing optimal pit stop strategies. At the bottom, in the same neat handwriting from the hallway equation, was a simple note. Learning should be an adventure. EF. Carter completed all the problems that night. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to know if the pirates would reach their island, if the astronauts would make it home. The next morning, he slipped his solutions under the door of the janitor's supply closet, along with a note of his own. The astronauts made it. Thank you. This secret exchange continued for 2 weeks. Each night, new problems appeared in Carter's backpack, each one teaching a concept through story and imagination. Carter's official test scores began to show improvement, small at first, then more noticeable. His tutors claimed credit, of course, but Evelyn noticed the change went deeper than numbers on a page. Her son walked taller, spoke with more confidence, even attempted to explain a physics concept to her using tennis balls and oranges as props. The truth about Elias emerged by accident, as most truths do. Carter had stayed late again, hoping to catch his secret teacher in the hallway. Instead, he found Elias's worn notebook left behind on the cleaning cart. The pages were filled with lesson plans, teaching strategies, and detailed notes about different learning styles. On the inside cover, in faded ink, was written, Property of Mr. Flynn, Riverside Elementary, Excellence in Mathematics Education Award. 2015. Carter photographed the page with his phone and presented it to his mother that evening. Evelyn stared at the image for a long moment, processing this revelation. A former award-winning teacher working as a janitor in her building. The incongruity of it bothered her less than her own assumptions. Her quick judgment based on nothing more than a mop and bucket. Why would a teacher become a janitor? She asked, more to herself than to Carter. Maybe he had reasons, Carter replied with wisdom beyond his years. Good people sometimes have hard times. The National Scholarship Examination was announced the following week. Sterling Enterprises would sponsor 20 students for full rides to the country's most prestigious preparatory schools. The competition would be fierce, the tests comprehensive, and for the first time in his life, Carter wanted to try. Not because his mother expected it, not because failure meant boarding school, but because Elias had taught him that understanding was its own reward. Evelyn watched her son prepare with a mixture of pride and trepidation. She had hired additional tutors, purchased every practice book available, scheduled sessions with education consultants. Yet she knew the real change had come from those stolen moments in the hallway, from word problems about pirates and astronauts, from a janitor who saw her son as more than a legacy to be protected. 3 nights before the examination, Evelyn found herself walking the hallways after hours. She told herself she was reviewing quarterly reports, but her feet carried her to the supply closet on the 36th floor. Elias was there, mixing cleaning solutions with the precise measurements of someone who had once mixed chemical equations for demonstration. "Mr. Flynn," she said, and he turned, unsurprised by her presence. "Miss Sterling." They regarded each other across the small space, 2 single parents carrying the weight of their children's futures. Evelyn had prepared a speech about boundaries and appropriate conduct, but what came out instead was, "Why didn't you tell anyone about your teaching background?" Elias set down his supplies, considering his answer. "Because I'm not that person anymore. After my wife died, after the medical bills, after I couldn't stand in front of a classroom without seeing her empty chair at parent conferences, I needed something simple, something that let me be home during the day for my daughter, work when she was sleeping. Cleaning these offices pays better than teaching ever did, and it's honest work." The raw honesty in his voice dismantled Evelyn's corporate armor piece by piece. She saw him clearly for the first time, not as a janitor or even as a teacher, but as a parent doing whatever it took to survive and provide. The recognition was like looking in a mirror. "Carter's improved," she said finally. "His tutors are baffled." "Carter's brilliant," Elias replied. "He just needed someone to show him that learning isn't about being perfect. It's about being curious." "Is that the secret you've been teaching him?" "Part of it." Elias pulled out a worn piece of paper from his pocket, the same kind he had been leaving for Carter. "The real secret is that failure isn't the opposite of success. It's a stepping stone to understanding. Every wrong answer teaches us something about finding the right one." Evelyn took the paper, reading the simple problem about a mother bird teaching her babies to fly, calculating distance and wind speed, but really telling a story about courage and trust. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "Would you consider tutoring him officially?" she asked. "I could arrange proper compensation, set up a formal schedule." "No," Elias interrupted gently. "The moment it becomes official, it becomes obligation. Carter doesn't need another obligation. He needs to remember that learning can be joy." They parted that night with an understanding that transcended contracts and formal arrangements. Elias would continue his secret lessons, Evelyn would pretend not to notice, and Carter would grow in the space they created between official and unofficial, between expectation and discovery. The day of the examination arrived, wrapped in unusual spring warmth. The Sterling Enterprises Conference Center had been transformed into a testing facility, with rows of desks, proctors, and parents filling the observation gallery. Media representatives lined the back wall, ready to document this display of corporate philanthropy and academic excellence. Carter sat at desk number 47, his lucky number since Elias had taught him about prime numbers through a story about unique snowflakes. His mother sat in the gallery, hands folded in her lap with practiced calm that didn't quite reach her eyes. Elias was there too, in his janitor's uniform, ostensibly checking the ventilation systems but really offering silent support from the edges of the room. The examination booklet was thick, intimidating in its weight and possibility. Carter opened it and felt the familiar flutter of panic in his chest. The numbers and words began their usual dance of confusion. But then he heard Elias's voice in his memory. Breathe. Read. Understand. Every problem is just a story waiting for an ending. He read the first question again, slower this time, and suddenly saw the pirate ship hidden in the geometry problem. The second question revealed astronauts calculating fuel consumption. By the third question, Carter was smiling, his pencil moving with confidence across the page. He wasn't just solving problems, he was completing adventures. In the gallery, Evelyn watched her son transform. The hunched shoulders straightened, the nervous fidgeting stilled, and in its place emerged a focus she had never seen before. She found herself looking for Elias, catching his eye across the room. He nodded once, a gesture so small others might have missed it. But to Evelyn, it spoke volumes about faith and patience, and the courage to let children find their own way. The examination lasted 3 hours. Some students finished early, leaving with either confidence or defeat written on their faces. Carter worked until the final minute, not because he struggled, but because he was thorough, checking his work the way Elias had taught him, ensuring every astronaut made it home, every pirate found their treasure. When time was called, Carter set down his pencil and looked up, finding his mother's eyes first, then Elias's. Both adults saw something new in his face, not just pride in completion, but genuine satisfaction in the effort itself. He had learned the secret that neither success nor failure defined him, but rather the willingness to try, to understand, to grow. The results would take 2 weeks to process, but in the moments after the examination, an unexpected scene unfolded. Carter walked directly to Elias, ignoring protocol and propriety, and hugged the janitor who had become his teacher. The room fell silent, cameras clicking, capturing the moment when social boundaries dissolved in the face of genuine gratitude. Evelyn rose from her seat, her designer heels clicking across the floor with purpose. The crowd parted, expecting corporate damage control, perhaps even disciplinary action. Instead, she extended her hand to Elias, a gesture that photography would later capture as the beginning of something larger than a handshake. "Thank you," she said, loud enough for the room to hear, "for seeing what I couldn't, for teaching what I didn't know how to teach." Elias accepted her hand, his calloused palm against her manicured fingers, a contrast that suddenly seemed irrelevant. "Every child has their own way of learning," he replied. Carter just needed someone to help him find his. The media loved the story, of course. The billionaire's son and the janitor teacher became a sensation that Evelyn initially tried to control, then realized she didn't want to. The narrative that emerged wasn't about charity or corporate responsibility, but about the unexpected places wisdom could be found, about the democracy of knowledge and kindness. 2 weeks later, when the results arrived, Carter had not only passed but scored in the 92nd percentile. The scholarship was his, along with acceptance letters from 3 prestigious schools. But the real victory came in a quieter moment, when Carter solved a complex equation on his mother's office whiteboard without prompting, explaining his process with the confidence of someone who understood rather than memorized. The Sterling Enterprises board suggested capitalizing on the positive publicity by creating a foundation, perhaps hiring Elias as its director. Evelyn considered it, even drafted the proposal, but something in her knew that institutionalizing what had happened would diminish its truth. Instead, she made a different proposition. She found Elias in his usual evening routine, methodically cleaning the executive conference room. His daughter Sarah was with him that night, sitting in a corner working on homework, her inhaler visible in her backpack's side pocket. The little girl looked up when Evelyn entered, her eyes holding the same steady warmth as her father's. "Miss Sterling," Elias began. But Evelyn raised her hand. "Evelyn," she corrected. "After everything, I think we can use first names." She sat down at the conference table, a CEO in a $5,000 suit, sitting across from a janitor and his daughter. And somehow, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. What she proposed wasn't charity or corporate structure, but partnership. A learning center within Sterling Enterprises, not for executives' children, but for all employees' families. A place where learning could be joy, where failure was just another step toward understanding. You would run it, she said. Not as a janitor who teaches, but as a teacher who happened to be a janitor. Same night hours if you prefer, so you can be with Sarah during the day. Full benefits, proper salary, and most importantly, complete autonomy in your methods. Elias looked at his daughter, who was pretending to focus on her homework but clearly listening to every word. What do you think, Princess? Should Daddy go back to teaching? Sarah's smile could have powered the entire building. Only if you tell the pirate stories. The center opened 3 months later, transformed from unused storage space into a learning laboratory, where word problems came alive and equations told stories. Carter was its first unofficial assistant, helping younger children see the adventures hidden in their homework. Sarah became a regular, her breathing easier in the filtered air system Evelyn had specially installed. As autumn painted the city in shades of gold and amber, patterns emerged that had nothing to do with mathematics or corporate structure. Evelyn found reasons to visit the learning center in the evenings, ostensibly checking on the investment but really drawn to the sound of children laughing over lessons. Elias began leaving small notes in her office. Not word problems, but observations about Carter's progress. About Sarah's improving health. About the way certain afternoon light made the city look like a geometry theorem. Their relationship developed with the same patience Elias brought to teaching. Built on shared smiles over children's successes. Conversations that stretched beyond education into dreams and fears. Moments when their hands would brush while reviewing student work and neither would pull away. It wasn't a fairy tale romance, but something more solid, constructed from mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that love, like learning, was a process rather than a destination. The holiday season brought its own magic to the Learning Center. Carter organized a showcase where students presented their favorite problems as theatrical performances. Pirates calculated treasure on stage, astronauts demonstrated zero-gravity mathematics, and race car drivers explained velocity through interpretive dance. The audience, a mixture of executives, janitors, middle management, and mailroom clerks, applauded with equal enthusiasm. During the intermission, Evelyn found herself standing beside Elias, watching their children interact with easy friendship. Sarah was showing Carter her new inhaler, decorated with stickers of stars and equations. Carter was explaining his latest problem creation, something about dragons and compound interest that made Sarah giggle. "They're good for each other," Elias observed. "Like their parents," Evelyn replied, then caught herself, color rising in her cheeks. Elias turned to her, his expression serious but warm. "Evelyn, I need you to know something. I'm not interested in your money or position. If anything, those things make this harder. But watching you with Carter, seeing how you've changed your entire worldview for his happiness, knowing you created this center not for publicity but for genuine good, that's what I see. That's what matters." Before she could respond, the lights dimmed for the second act. But in the darkness, she found his hand, and this time, neither of them let go. Winter arrived with unusual snowfall that turned the city into a mathematical wonderland. Elias taught lessons about crystalline structures and fractal patterns, while Evelyn found herself canceling board meetings to attend snowball fight calculations in the corporate courtyard. The lines between their professional and personal lives blurred like frost on windows, beautiful in their imprecision. The change in Carter was remarkable, but no more so than the change in Evelyn. The woman who had once measured worth in quarterly reports now celebrated small victories, a child understanding fractions, Sarah breathing easily through a full day, Elias smiling at her terrible attempts at word problems. She was still a formidable CEO, but her power now came from understanding that strength could coexist with gentleness. Spring brought decision time. Carter's scholarship required him to choose a school, to step into a future that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. The prestigious boarding schools courted him with promises of excellence and tradition, but Carter had learned to see beyond surface presentations. "I want to stay in the city," he announced over dinner, a meal that had naturally evolved to include Elias and Sarah. "Harrison Day School has accepted me, and they have an innovative mathematics program. Plus, I could keep helping at the center." Evelyn started to speak about opportunities and advantages, but Elias caught her eye, and she understood. This was Carter's choice, his understanding of what would make him happy rather than what would impress others. "It's your decision," she said, and meant it. The school year ended with a celebration at the Learning Center. Students presented their final projects. Parents mingled regardless of their floor assignment in the corporate hierarchy, and success was measured in understanding rather than grades. Carter had prepared a special presentation, a complex problem about a single father and a CEO finding common ground through standard deviation and probability. As he explained his calculations, showing how two seemingly different paths could intersect at exactly the right moment, Evelyn and Elias stood together, their children beside them, understanding that some equations were too beautiful to be coincidence. The following autumn, as Carter began at Harrison Day School, excelling not because he had to, but because he wanted to, changes rippled through Sterling Enterprises. The Learning Center expanded, employee satisfaction soared, and productivity increased in ways that couldn't be captured in spreadsheets. The financial press called it the Sterling model, but those who lived it knew it was simpler than that. It was about seeing people for who they could become rather than what their titles said they were. Elias officially moved from janitor to director of educational initiatives, though he insisted on keeping his old uniform in his office, a reminder of where the journey began. His relationship with Evelyn had evolved into something the gossip columnists struggled to define. Not a scandal, not a fairy tale, but a steady partnership built on shared values and quiet affection. One evening, as the city lights painted the Learning Center in golden shadow, Carter sat with Sarah, helping her with a particularly tricky word problem about birds learning to fly. Evelyn and Elias watched from the doorway. Their reflections merged in the glass, creating a single image from two separate people. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Evelyn asked. "Every day," Elias replied. "But different doesn't mean better. Sometimes the longest route teaches us the most important lessons." She turned to him, seeing in his eyes the same patient wisdom that had saved her son, that had saved her from a life measured only in achievements rather than connections. Like Carter's problems, the journey matters more than the destination. "Now you're learning," he said with a smile that transformed his weathered face into something beautiful. As the seasons cycled through another year, the four of them became a family in all but official documentation. They shared Sunday dinners and homework sessions, celebrated victories both large and small, weathered Sarah's asthma attacks and Carter's occasional academic frustrations with equal unity. Love grew between them like Elias's equations, complex but solvable, challenging but ultimately rewarding. The scholarship examination came around again, and this time Carter served as a mentor for nervous students. He told them about pirates and astronauts, about finding stories in numbers, about a janitor who saw potential where others saw failure. Some of the parents recognized him, the billionaire's son who had learned from unexpected places, and they began to understand that wisdom didn't always come from traditional sources. Evelyn watched her son teach with the same patience Elias had shown him, and felt something complete in her chest, like the final number in a long equation. Success, she had learned, wasn't about never failing. It was about understanding that every failure was just practice for getting it right, that every person had something valuable to teach, that love could grow in the most unexpected places. The story could end here, with its lessons learned and hearts opened. But life, like mathematics, continues beyond the final calculation. Carter would go on to study theoretical physics, approaching it with the joy Elias had taught him. Sarah would overcome her asthma through careful treatment and fierce determination, becoming a teacher like her father. Evelyn would transform Sterling Enterprises into a model for corporate responsibility, proving that humanity and profit weren't mutually exclusive. And Elias would continue teaching, showing children and adults alike that understanding was its own reward, that everyone had their own way of learning, that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. He would marry Evelyn on a spring day when the cherry blossoms turned the city into a poem, with Carter and Sarah as their witnesses, their family complete in its imperfection. But that's the future, stretching ahead like an unsolved equation waiting for its variables. For now, in this moment, a man who was once a janitor sits with a woman who was once too proud to see beyond titles, watching their children solve problems together, understanding finally that the greatest secret wasn't about passing tests or meeting expectations. The secret was simpler and more profound, that every person carries wisdom worth discovering, that failure is just understanding in disguise, and that love, like learning, grows strongest when nurtured with patience, kindness, and the courage to see beyond surface appearances to the truth that lies beneath. As the lights of the city twinkled beyond the windows, Carter looked up from his work, catching Elias's eye. The boy mouthed 2 words silently. "Thank you." Elias nodded, his eyes bright with emotion, and mouthed back, "Thank you too." Because in the end, they had all been teachers, and they had all been students, and the lessons they learned together were worth more than any test score could ever measure. The secret wasn't about being perfect or never failing. It was about understanding that every challenge was an opportunity, every person had something valuable to offer, and every ending was really just another beginning, waiting to be discovered.